July 9, 1944, the northern tip of Saipan. The air is heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of cordite and the salt spray rising from the churning Pacific below. On the jagged limestone plateau of Marpi Point, a young Japanese woman stands paralyzed at the edge of the abyss. Her uniform is torn, her skin stained with the red clay of the island. Behind her, the rumble of artillery signals the end of the Imperial Japanese Army's resistance. Ahead of her lies a 300-foot drop to the rocks. She clutches a jagged stone, ready to use it on herself. She has been told for months that the Americans are monsters, hairy, horned devils who will torture, rape, and devour the Emperor's children. A figure emerges from the tall kunai grass. It is a giant of a man, clad in olive drab, wielding a rifle. She flinches, waiting for the beast to strike, but the weapon lowers. The giant does not scream or lunge. Instead, he reaches into a pouch and extends a hand. It holds not a bayonet, but a canteen of water. In that suspended second, the terrifying mythology of an entire empire begins to crack. The architecture of fear. To understand why a dehydrated, trembling woman would prefer the jagged rocks of a cliffside to the outstretched hand of an American soldier, we must look beyond the battlefield and into the machinery of the imperial mind. The panic on Marpi Point was not a spontaneous reaction to the violence of war. It was the calculated result of a psychological conditioning program that had been running for years. The Empire of Japan had not just fortified the beaches of the Pacific, they had fortified the minds of their subjects against the very concept of survival. By 1944, the Pacific War had turned decisively against Tokyo. The defensive perimeter was shrinking, bringing the conflict to islands inhabited by thousands of Japanese civilians, settlers, farmers, and cane workers who had lived in the Marianas for decades. As the American frontline crept closer, the Imperial High Command issued a directive that would seal the fate of thousands. It was the ideology of Gyokusai, the shattered jewel. The phrase was poetic, derived from ancient Chinese text, implying that it is better to shatter like a beautiful jewel than to remain whole as a common tile. In military terms, it meant annihilation was preferable to surrender. But critically, as the war reached the frantic stage of the absolute national defense zone, this code was no longer reserved for the soldier. It was imposed upon the mother, the grandmother, and the child. The propaganda machine worked with terrifying efficiency to ensure this compliance. The Japanese government controlled every frequency of radio and every column of newsprint, painting a picture of the enemy that was less human and more demonic. The phrase Kichiku Bae, demon beast Americans and British, was drilled into the national consciousness. This was not merely calling the enemy bad, it was a literal dehumanization. Civilians were told that American Marines were recruited from insane asylums and prisons, released only to wreak havoc on the purity of the Japanese spirit. For the women of Saipan and later Okinawa, the narratives were specifically tailored to exploit their deepest vulnerabilities. They were not warned of strategic defeat, they were warned of personal violation. Imperial officers and local police chiefs gathered village assemblies, delivering grim lectures on the fate that awaited them if the hairy barbarians landed. They were told that American soldiers would rape every woman, torture every child, and run tanks over the elderly for sport. Stories circulated that the Americans demanded a rite of passage for their troops that involved the murder of civilians. These lies were watered with the blood of patriotism, making the act of suicide seem not like a tragedy, but a final, defiant act of protecting one's virtue and the emperor's honor. This conditioning created a unique battlefield dynamic that the approaching American forces were completely unprepared to navigate. In the West, the capture of a town usually meant the civilians would hide until the shooting stopped, then emerge to find food and safety. In the Japanese worldview of 1944, the arrival of the enemy was the arrival of the apocalypse. There was no concept of a POW camp or humane treatment in the script these civilians had been given. There was only victory or death. As the U.S. Fifth Fleet gathered its strength in the vast blue expanse of the Pacific, carrying over 120,000 Marines and soldiers toward the Marianas, the tension on the islands reached a breaking point. The civilians were trapped. Behind them lay the unforgiving sea. Ahead of them lay the landing beaches where the devils would soon emerge. The authorities began distributing hand grenades not just to infantry squads, but to heads of households. In the absence of weapons, fathers were instructed on how to kill their families to save them. The poison had been administered long before the first shell was fired. The minds of the civilians were already casualties of war, trapped in a nightmare where the only escape was self-destruction. The stage was set for a collision not just of armies, but of realities. The collision course. By the summer of 1944, the geography of the war had shifted fundamentally. The early island-hopping campaigns, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, the Marshalls, had largely taken place on sparsely populated atolls or military outposts. The Marines were accustomed to fighting entrenched garrisons in jungles where the only living things were soldiers and local wildlife. But as the American juggernaut turned its eyes toward the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the nature of the battlefield changed. These were not just military bases, they were functioning colonies. Saipan had been under Japanese control since World War I, home to nearly 30,000 Japanese civilians who ran sugar plantations, schools, and bustling towns like Garapan. To the American strategists, Saipan was a simple geometric necessity. It was exactly 1,300 miles from Tokyo, the precise operational range of the new B-29 Superfortress bomber. Capturing Saipan meant opening the door to the Japanese home islands. To the Japanese High Command, losing Saipan meant the beginning of the end. This strategic desperation ensured that the defense would be absolute. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, commanding the island's defense, knew he could not win. His objective was to bleed the Americans, to make the price of conquest so astronomically high that Washington would sue for peace. And in this equation of attrition, the civilian population became a tool of war. As the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the largest armada the world had ever seen up to that point, darkened the horizon in mid-June, the island was transformed into a chaotic fortress. The Japanese army retreated from the beaches into the rugged interior, dragging the civilian population with them. The geography of Saipan is dominated by limestone ridges, deep ravines, and thousands of natural caves. These caves, intended by nature's shelters, became tombs. Families were herded into damp, dark recesses alongside ammunition crates and wounded soldiers. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant began to dissolve. Women cooked for soldiers, children carried water to machine gun nests. They were physically integrated into the defensive line, sharing the same space, the same starvation, and the same terror. When the bombardment began, the violence was beyond comprehension. The Americans unleashed a typhoon of steel, a relentless naval and aerial pounding designed to pulverize the defenses. For the civilians hiding in the caves, the war became a sensory overload of shaking earth and deafening noise. But the true horror lay in the movement. As the Marines fought their way inland, pushing relentlessly north, the Japanese military and the civilian refugees were compressed into a smaller and smaller pocket of land. They were being pushed toward the cliffs of the northern tip. The American soldiers storming the beaches of Saipan on June 15th were hardened veterans, but they were psychologically unprepared for what they were about to encounter. A U.S. Marine is trained to neutralize threats, to clear bunkers, and to survive ambushes. He is not trained to handle a mother charging a tank with a bamboo spear or a family blowing themselves up with a grenade in a roadside ditch. The intelligence briefings had mentioned civilians, but they had not prepared the troops for the mass psychosis they would witness. The Americans assumed that once the main resistance was broken, the civilians would surrender. They did not understand that to the people hiding in the caves, the tall, well-fed Americans approaching their positions were not liberators, but the devils from the radio broadcasts coming to collect their payment in blood. The stage was now set for a tragic misunderstanding of catastrophic proportions. On one side, thousands of terrified women and children, starving and conditioned to believe death was their only salvation. On the other, tens of thousands of heavily armed Americans, exhausted, on edge, and operating in a kill-or-be-killed environment, completely unaware that their very appearance was confirming the worst nightmares of the people they were trying to bypass. The collision of these two worlds would produce some of the most harrowing and ultimately transformative moments of the Pacific War. The mythology of monsters. To comprehend the sheer terror in the eyes of the women on Saipan, we must dissect the specific anatomy of the lies they were fed. This was not vague anti-American sentiment. It was a detailed, graphic catalogue of horrors designed to trigger primal panic. In the months leading up to the invasion, the Kempeitai military police and local officials circulated stories that the Americans were not merely soldiers, but a subhuman species driven by sadistic lust. Women were told, with absolute conviction by authority figures they trusted, that the Marines would rape them in front of their families before killing them. One particularly pervasive rumor claimed that American soldiers were required to kill a Japanese civilian as a rite of passage to become a full Marine. Another whispered horror was that the giant tanks, the Sherman monsters, were deliberately driven over the bodies of the elderly and children to pave the roads. These stories were spread through neighborhood associations, tonarigumi, ensuring that the fear was communal. If a woman expressed doubt, she was shamed or accused of being unpatriotic. The propaganda was so total that many women believed the Americans possessed physical deformities, horns, tails, or red skin, traits of the Oni, the demons of Japanese folklore. This fused the modern war with ancient superstition, making the invader a supernatural threat that could not be reasoned with, only escaped through death. Angle 2. The Enforcers of Death. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that the greatest immediate threat to the civilians often came not from the Americans, but from their own protectors. As the Japanese perimeter collapsed, the Imperial Army's priority shifted from defense to the preservation of the national polity, Gyokusai. This meant ensuring that no Japanese subject fell into enemy hands to be corrupted. Japanese soldiers, themselves starving and pushed to the brink of madness, became the enforcers of suicide. Survivors recounted harrowing scenes in the crowded caves where officers would distribute grenades to fathers, instructing them on the honorable thing to do. If a family hesitated, or if a mother clutched her child too tightly, refusing to jump, they were often threatened with execution by their own troops. There were documented instances where soldiers pushed women off cliffs or shot into groups of civilians who were attempting to surrender. The civilians were trapped in a vice, the American devils approaching from the front and the bayonets of the Imperial Army at their backs. The psychological pressure was suffocating. To surrender was treason, to live was a sin. Angle 3. The GIs dilemma. Flip the lens to the American perspective, and the picture becomes one of profound confusion and growing horror. The average U.S. Marine or Army infantryman on Saipan was a young man, likely in his early 20s, drafted from a farm in Iowa or a factory in Detroit. He had been trained to fight armed combatants, to hate the Jap soldier who had bombed Pearl Harbor, but he had no framework for fighting a population that wanted to die. Combat reports from the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions are filled with accounts of soldiers holding their fire, waving their arms and screaming, "Don't jump, we won't hurt you," in broken Japanese or plain English. They offered cans of sea rations, chocolate bars, and water canteens, universal gestures of goodwill. Yet they watched in disbelief as these gestures were interpreted as traps. When a Marine threw a can of food to a starving family, the father might kick it away, believing it was poisoned. When a corpsman approached with a medical kit to treat a wounded child, the mother would often smother the child to save it from the torture she believed was imminent. For the American GI, this was a psychological trauma of a different kind. The helplessness of trying to save someone who is terrified of your salvation. The voice in the dark. Amidst this landscape of absolute terror, an anomaly emerged, a tactical glitch in the Japanese expectation of death. His name was Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, a Mexican-American Marine from East Los Angeles. Gabaldon was a unique weapon in the U.S. arsenal, not because of his marksmanship, but because of his childhood, raised partly by a Japanese-American family. He spoke the language, not the formal, stilted Japanese taught in military intelligence schools, but the street slang, the colloquial rhythms of a neighbor. While other Marines threw grenades into caves to silence the enemy, Gabaldon went rogue. He would slip into the enemy territory alone, armed often with nothing but a pistol and packs of cigarettes. He approached the cave mouths not with a flamethrower, but with a voice. "Come out," he would whisper in their own tongue. "We have food, we have water, no one will hurt you." To the civilians huddled in the darkness, this was a mind-breaking contradiction. The monster outside was speaking to them like a human being. He wasn't screaming orders, he was offering a conversation. Gabaldon capitalized on the hesitation. He would capture 2 or 3 civilians, treat them with exaggerated kindness, and then send them back into the caves as living proof that the propaganda was a lie. These returnees were walking paradoxes. They had touched the devil and returned unharmed, bellies full of American rations. Gabaldon's Pied Piper tactics were responsible for the surrender of over 1,000 soldiers and civilians, proving that the wall of fear was not impenetrable. It just required the right frequency to shatter. The reign of paper. While Gabaldon worked the caves personally, the American military command launched a massive industrial effort to break the psychological stranglehold. Realizing that bullets were only driving the civilians deeper into the suicide mindset, the U.S. psychological warfare units shifted tactics. They began a bombardment of paper. Planes dropped thousands of leaflets over the shrinking Japanese lines. These were not demands for unconditional surrender, but life-saving passes. The leaflets were carefully designed. They featured photos of Japanese prisoners eating rice, smoking cigarettes, and receiving medical care. The text, written by Nisei second-generation Japanese Americans, translators, used respectful language. They pleaded, "Do not die uselessly, your country needs you to rebuild." For a Japanese mother crouching in a ravine, holding a leaflet she had snatched from the dirt, this piece of paper was a terrifying object. To be caught with it by a Japanese officer meant immediate execution for treason. Yet the image on the paper, a Japanese child drinking milk from an American cup, burned into her mind. It created a fracture in the official narrative. The cognitive dissonance was agonizing. The radio said death, but the sky was raining life. This hesitation, this split second of doubt planted by a piece of falling paper, would become the difference between leaping from a cliff and walking toward the enemy lines. It was a war of ideas fought in the mud, where the weapon was a photograph of a bowl of rice. The physical abyss. There was also a jarring physical reality that reinforced the fear. The visual contrast between the conquerors and the conquered was stark. The Japanese civilians had been on starvation rations for months. They were emaciated, small in stature, and covered in the filth of the caves. The Americans, by comparison, seemed like giants. The average height of a U.S. Marine was significantly taller than the average Japanese citizen of the era. Clad in heavy helmets, bulky flak jackets, and carrying semi-automatic weaponry, they looked robotic, massive, and alien. To a Japanese child looking up from a dark cave, a 6-foot-tall American covered in the grime of war, perhaps with a week's growth of beard, did not look like a human being. He looked exactly like the Oni the posters had warned about. The Americans unknowingly fit the costume of the monster. The language barrier completed the wall. The guttural shouts of Marines clearing coves, "Gut out, come ut," sundered like barking beasts to ears that spoke no English. It was a clash of civilizations, where every visual and auditory cue reinforced the catastrophic misunderstanding. The edge of the world. July 1944, Marpi Point. The tragedy of Saipan culminated on the northernmost tip of the island, a place that history would rechristen with names of grim literalism, Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff. Here, the collision between the American advance and the Japanese retreat ran out of land. The geography itself became the final enemy. A plateau of jagged limestone dropped 800 feet into the jungle on one side and crashed into the churning Pacific on the other. Thousands of civilians, herded like cattle by the retreating Imperial Army and their own terror, found themselves trapped on this precipice. The scene described by witnesses, both American and Japanese, resembled a vision of hell painted by Harunoma's brush. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of unburied bodies. Below in the water, the U.S. Navy patrol boats idled, their crews watching through binoculars in stunned silence. They had come to fight a war, to destroy ships and storm bunkers. They were not prepared to watch a genocide of self-inflicted despair. On the cliff edge, the propaganda bore its final poisonous fruit. American interpreters, rigged with loudspeakers on half-tracks and landing craft, blasted pleas across the gap. "Do not jump, We have water, we have food. Please, for the sake of your children, stop." But the words were drowned out by the years of indoctrination. Marines watched, helpless, as mothers combed their daughters' hair for the last time, tied their blindfolds, and stepped off the ledge. Fathers threw their infants into the surf before following them. Entire families, holding hands, walked backward off the cliffs so they wouldn't have to see the rocks coming. The accounts from the American side are marked by a deep, traumatic confusion. One Marine corporal described watching a woman in a white kimono appear on the cliff edge. She methodically tossed a grenade to her children, then bowed toward the Imperial Palace in Tokyo before jumping. The Marines fired into the air, they shouted, some even wept openly, begging the civilians to stop. But the distance was too great, not the physical distance of the ravine, but the psychological distance of the lie. To the people on the cliff, the Americans shouting, "Come here," were demons luring them to a fate worse than death. The crashing waves below, stained pink with blood, seemed a safer harbor than the arms of the enemy. Yet amidst this carnage, the turning point began to manifest in the caves and ravines just south of the cliffs. Here, the contact was not observed through binoculars, but experienced face to face. Small groups of civilians, too exhausted to climb the cliffs or separated from the darker influence of the Imperial soldiers, found themselves cornered by U.S. patrols. This was the moment of absolute friction. A Marine squad, weapons raised, fingers tense on triggers, rounding a limestone bend to find a huddled group of women and children. The tension in these seconds was suffocating. One wrong move, a sudden reach for a bag, a scream that sounded like a signal, and the Marines would fire. They had been booby-trapped before, they had seen surrendering soldiers pull grenade pins, but in these specific, quiet moments the discipline held. The Marines did not fire, they froze, they lowered their rifles, and they waited. For the Japanese civilians, staring down the barrels of the guns, this was the moment the world was supposed to end. They squeezed their eyes shut, waiting for the torture to begin. He collapse of the demon. The silence in the ravine stretches, heavy and suffocating. It is a standoff between two realities. In the mind of the Japanese woman cowering against the limestone wall, the American standing before her is about to begin the ritual of slaughter. She holds her breath, eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the blow. But the blow never comes. Instead, she hears a sound that doesn't fit the nightmare, the clinking of a chain, the unscrewing of a cap. She opens her eyes to see the giant kneeling. He is not reaching for the bayonet at his hip. He is holding out a battered aluminum canteen. The water inside sloshes audibly, a sound of pure agony to a throat parched by days of hiding in dry caves. The Marine waits. He doesn't shout. He takes a sip himself, a universal gesture to prove it isn't poison, and extends it again. "Mizu," he says, butchering the pronunciation, but the meaning is clear: water. Tentatively, with the trembling motion of a frightened animal, she reaches out. Her fingers brush against the soldier's gloved hand. The contact is electric. It is the first physical touch between the Empire and the enemy that is not violent. She grabs the canteen and drinks desperately. It is cool, clean water. She waits for the pain, for the poison, but there is only relief. Then comes the second shock. The Marine reaches into his tunic and pulls out a distinctively wrapped bar, chocolate. He breaks off a piece and hands it to the child clinging to her leg. The child, too young to understand the politics of the war, but old enough to know starvation, eats it instantly. The woman looks up at the face of the devil. He is sweating. He looks tired. His eyes are not glowing red. They are blue or brown, and they are filled not with bloodlust, but with a strange, weary pity. He smiles, a human expression. In that instant, the entire psychological infrastructure of the Imperial lie collapses. The cognitive dissonance is violent. If they are monsters, why are they feeding us? If they are here to rape and kill, why is this man bandaging my daughter's cut leg? The life-saving pass was true. The monsters were a fiction. This scene repeats itself 1,000 times across the jagged terrain of Saipan and later Okinawa. The capture is rarely a military takedown. It is a medical rescue. Navy corpsmen, the docs, become the frontline diplomats. They treat maggot-infested wounds with sulfur powder and gentle hands. They carry elderly women on their backs down steep trails. They share their K-rations, tins of strange meat and biscuits, with people who were prepared to bite out their own tongues rather than surrender. For the Japanese women, this is a trauma of a different sort, the trauma of survival. They have to reconcile their existence with their honor. They were supposed to be dead. They were supposed to be shattered jewels. Instead, they are sitting on a crate of American supplies, eating American food, surrounded by the men they were taught to fear more than death itself. And these men are lighting cigarettes, showing photos of their girlfriends back home, and trying to make the children laugh. The phrase recorded in diaries and post-war interviews surfaces again and again. We have never seen men like this. They expected beasts. They found exhausted young men who missed their mothers. The invasion force had conquered the island with firepower, but they were conquering the survivors with something the Japanese high command had never accounted for: simple human decency. The spell of the Gyokusai was broken, not by bullets, but by a piece of chocolate and a bandage. The city of wire and rice. The survivors were loaded onto 6x6 trucks and jeeps, driven away from the blackened cliffs and into the secure zones. Their destination was Camp Suzup, a sprawling, improvised city of tents and barbed wire that would house nearly 18,000 civilians. For the women arriving at the gates, the terror had not entirely vanished. It had merely shifted forms. They were now in the belly of the beast. They watched the gates close, expecting the executions to begin. Instead, they were met with a cloud of white dust. American medical teams, obsessed with hygiene and preventing a typhus outbreak, lined up the prisoners and pumped them full of DDT powder. To a woman who had just crawled out of a cave filled with rotting corpses, this white powder coating her skin and hair felt like a strange ritual. But the result was immediate relief from the lice and fleas that had tormented them for months. Following the dusting came the doctors. The same devils they had feared were now sticking needles in their arms, not to kill them, but to vaccinate them. But the true shock, the one that broke the remaining psychological resistance, was the logistics of lunch. In the Empire, food had become a memory. Civilians had been subsisting on tree bark, snails, and whatever meager rations the military hadn't confiscated. At Camp Suzup, they saw mountains of crates. They saw open kitchens serving hot rice, tinned fish, and canned peaches. The Americans were not just feeding them, they were overfeeding them. The sheer wastefulness of the American supply chain, soldiers throwing away half-eaten cans of meat, was incomprehensible to a population drilled in austerity. The monsters were incredibly rich and strangely generous. Inside the camp, the women began to observe their captors with the scrutiny of anthropologists. They noticed something that contradicted everything the Imperial Army had taught them about military order. In the Japanese ranks, discipline was physical. An officer would strike a subordinate for the slightest infraction. It was a hierarchy of violence. But here, they saw American privates joking with sergeants. They saw officers waiting in line for chow alongside the enlisted men. There was no bowing, no face slapping, no screaming. The Americans seemed loose, almost undisciplined by Japanese standards, yet they had crushed the Imperial Dofunsas with terrifying efficiency. A realization began to whisper through the tents of Suzup. The Americans were not the UNI. They were, as one Japanese nurse described in her diary, big, loud children. They played harmonicas, they showed off photos of their dogs, and they seemed more interested in trading souvenirs than in conquering the world. The image of the rapacious demon dissolved, replaced by the reality of a homesick soldier from Kansas who just wanted the war to end. The women realized they were safe. And with safety came a devastating, quiet anger. The betrayal of the spirit. The relief found within the wire fences of Camp Suzup soon hardened into a profound, crushing realization. The emperor's government had lied. This was not a disagreement over strategy, it was a betrayal of life itself. The women looked at their sleeping children, bellies full of American rice, safe under American mosquito nets, and then they looked toward the smoking northern cliffs. They realized that their sisters, their mothers, and their neighbors lay broken on the rocks below, not because of American cruelty, but because of Japanese deception. The lie had been designed to protect the national polity, to ensure that no Japanese subject would suffer the shame of capture. But here, in the reality of the camp, shame felt abstract, while survival felt concrete. The psychological dam broke. The silence of the prisoners turned into vocal action. Many of the women, finding a newfound courage in their survival, volunteered for a task that would have been unthinkable days prior. They asked to go back. They boarded American jeeps, holding microphones connected to loudspeakers. They were driven to the edge of the jungle, to the mouths of the caves where the holdouts were still starving. They did not speak in military codes. They spoke as mothers and wives. Their voices boomed over the ravines. "I am alive. The Americans are kind. They have milk for the Barbies. Do not die. Come out." These broadcasts were devastatingly effective. Hearing the voice of a neighbor, someone known to be Dud, shut the resolve of those hiding in the dark. It was the ultimate refutation of the propaganda. The holdouts began to emerge, not in trickles, but in streams, skeletal figures blinking in the sunlight, weeping as they were embraced by the women who had come to save them. Yet the math of the tragedy remained stark. For every family that walked into Camp Sazyapa, the Americans found the remains of another that hadn't. The cliffs of Marpi Point remained a silent, jagged monument to the power of the lie. The bodies washing up in the surf for weeks after the battle served as a grim reminder of the cost of total war. But in the camps, a new reality was taking root. The demonization was over. The Japanese civilians and the American soldiers had looked at each other without the lens of propaganda and found a shared humanity. The Empire had demanded their death, but the enemy had given them back their lives. Today, the northern cliffs of Saipan are quiet. The jagged limestone, once stained with the tragedy of a nation, is now covered in wildflowers and memorials. Tourists stand at the railings of Banzai Cliff, looking out at the same azure sea that swallowed thousands of lives in the summer of 1944. The rusting hulks of Shuman tanks still sit in the lagoon, slowly dissolving into the coral, ghosts of the violence that forged this history. But the true legacy of Saipan is not found in the rusted metal or the silent stones. It is found in the memory of the encounter. The collision between the Japanese civilian and the American soldier was a test of humanity's breaking point. It was a confrontation between a meticulously constructed lie and a messy, imperfect, but undeniable truth. The Empire had bet everything on the idea that fear was stronger than life. They were wrong. The image of a trembling woman accepting a canteen of water from a dusty, exhausted Marine is one of the most powerful tableaus of the Pacific War. It did not end the fighting. The carnage of Owajama and Okinawa still lay ahead, but it signaled the beginning of the end for the ideology of total death. It proved that the demonization of the other is a fragile construct, easily shattered by the simplest acts of decency. A bandage, a piece of chocolate, a hesitation to pull the trigger. These survivors, the women who walked out of the caves of Saipan, became the living bridges between two worlds. They carried the truth back to their homeland after the surrender, that the enemy was not a monster, but a man. This realization planted the seeds for the remarkable transformation that would follow the war, where bitter enemies became the staunchest of allies. In the end, the battle for Saipan teaches us a haunting lesson about the cost of war. It shows us that while armies can conquer territory with fire and steel, they can only conquer fear with mercy. The tragedy of the cliffs will never be forgotten, but neither will the moment when the guns were lowered, and for the first time in the darkness of the cave, a hand was reached out in peace.